Shalom, shalom, friends. It's a pleasure and delight to be here today with Professor James Loeffler, who is the J. Berkowitz Professor of Jewish History at the University of Virginia. He's the author of Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century. That book recently won 2 prizes, the 2019 Association for Jewish Studies Schnitzer Award for Best Book in Modern Jewish History, Mazel Tov, and the 2019 American Historical Association Rosenberg Award for Best Book in Jewish History, Mazel Tov. At UVA, he teaches courses in Jewish and European history, international law and human rights, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he's a faculty fellow of the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab. Professor Loeffler, thank you for taking time.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to speak with you.
So to jump right in here, in your book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, you profile 5 Jews and their contribution to the development of international law and diplomacy. What historical trends made Jews so prominent in this field?
Sure. Well, I was curious about that question myself, and I had some assumptions going into the research for this book. I thought, like many of us, well, the Holocaust, right? Jews are victims of antisemitism, and I also thought Tikkun Olam. Jews have we have a terrific old tradition of ethical reasoning. But when I looked specifically at the people inside the story of who gave us things like international human rights, crimes against humanity as a legal doctrine to punish the Nazis, all kinds of things like that, I found something else linked to them. By and large, they were all Jews who came of age after World War I, not World War II. They were activists involved in Jewish life and Jewish politics. And surprisingly, what linked them was that they were deeply involved in Jewish political life, most of them with Zionism and with Jewish nationalism. And that turns out to be very important for understanding where human rights comes from, as well as the Jewish pathway into it.
Very interesting. So as you mentioned, several of these Jews you described who were instrumental in international diplomacy following World War I, such as Zvi Hirsch, Lauterpacht, and Jacob Robinson, were also ardent Zionists. And at face value, such a trend, some might suggest, seems paradoxical, where if the role of international law is to create a utopian national order, rather than creating a nation state for Jews in particular, would that contradict the goal? How were these Jews able to navigate a tension of a state just for Jews and sort of this universalistic vision?
Sure. It's a wonderful question, and it's one of the hardest questions for us to think about today because there's so much pressure and polarization when we think about these topics, right? Zionism and human rights. So the answer is this. Like Jews before them, these are people who came up acutely aware of what it means to be a minority, to be small in the world, to be small in number, to have big dreams, but to recognize that you will never have an empire. You will never become the British Empire or the Roman Empire. And so you have to have ways to imagine what the world could and should look like to protect you and protect other people. So what I think really links them is a sense that Jews are a minority, and thinking about international law was a way to protect that minority and other minorities. And it was also a way to pair that minority, a sense of collective identity, who we are, our religion, our culture, our languages, that they should be protected as a minority from threats. But they also recognized that the way you act in the world is to have a homeland, to act like a nation state, because that's the way the world is trending. So they saw both these things as interrelated. And they imagined themselves as building a better version of the world where every people gets to have a nation. But today, that not all Jews are going to need to live in the Jewish land, and there will be non-Jews there. And Jews will continue to live in a diaspora. So for them, when they thought about law, when they thought about rights, they thought about how do we not erase the particular and all become universal or all cling to a particular. They thought about blending them, and that's what they were trying to do.
Very interesting. So you mentioned that your perceptions of the role of the Shoah were actually shattered a little bit, but I wonder, how did the Holocaust theologically, philosophically, morally, politically influence the actions of the people you described in your book? Of course, those are a bunch of people, and it's a complex question, so it's hard to profile, but what are some common themes here?
So the first common theme is These are people who all spent 2 decades essentially trying to prevent the Holocaust.
Wow.
The very things that we think of as the greatest crimes about it, the physical elimination of Jews, the attack on Jewish institutions, they were already fighting against this before the Holocaust. So it was not something that snuck up on them. It was something that they feared as the worst possible outcome, and they were trying to prevent. So when it happened, their responses reflected their own struggles. And the first thing that they felt when they saw the Holocaust was not, how can the Nazis do this? How can the anti-Semites do this to us? Their first thing is, how can we stand up in the world as Jews and get the world to take us seriously in our claims? And already in 1940, they're saying, how do we punish these Nazis? Even before they've perpetrated much of what we know as the Holocaust. These Jewish leaders were saying, we want a seat at the table. We want to be heard, and we need to do that. It is as important that we are heard by our friends as it is that we call out our enemies. And so the Holocaust was an event they tried to process in real time. Afterwards, they faced some of the same struggle. We might think that they immediately said, now the world has to wake up. But actually they said, no, now the world has to see what has happened to us, and that the Holocaust has a moral lesson for humanity, but part of that is recognizing us as a minority that suffered. So they were actually instrumental in building the Nuremberg trials. But one of the main failures they had is these people wanted there to be a Jewish voice. Jews should be able to testify not simply as victims of Nazi aggression and anti-Semitism. They wanted to be able to say, we are Jews who've lost something as Jews.
Fascinating. So today, there's a quite clear anti-Israel, and some would even say an anti-Semitic bias in international organizations such as the United Nations and the like. How do you think this became the case?
Right. So I talk a lot about that in the book, Rooted Cosmopolitans. And I emphasize that some of this has to do not only with the spillover of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not simply because of some generic anti-Semitism. A lot of it has to do with politics. People I write about in the book, after having spent decades being kind of heroes at the UN in the late 40s and in the 50s, began to find themselves turned into pariahs. A lot of it had to do with the Cold War. The Soviet Union weaponized a lot of images of anti-Zionism against Jews. And when Jews began to talk about how to fight anti-Semitism, it was the Soviets who pioneered a lot of techniques of discrediting Jewish spokesmen, Jewish NGO activists, by saying, well, you must represent Israel, or if you don't specifically deal with the conflict over there, you're not legitimate here. And not surprisingly, others embraced that. So I think the broad strokes Cold War can help to explain a lot of that. And then, frankly, I think a lot of it does simply have to do with something we still confront today, which is the political uses of anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that different groups would say privately to some of these activists, we're sympathetic to you, but we have to vote over here, because over here, they're the people who we have an alliance with. And I think it's worth recovering that truth, because it helps us understand that the world is not just a black and white set of people who are evil or good on our side or their side, but people struggling with political alliances, which are a fact of life for activists today in the Jewish world and beyond.
Fascinating. Okay, so just the last question for you today, kind of a broad one, a practical one. What do you think are some of the particular unique roles that Jews can play today as human rights advocates that's unique to the Jewish community and significant globally?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, our greatest challenge as advocates is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It doesn't go away. It enters into all conversations, and it allows people to challenge our motives, as well as it forces hard questions on us. But the challenge, I think, is an opportunity, because it means that we can tell people, and this is true for Americans as a whole, that instead of a yes, but approach, we can have a yes, and approach. We can say, that is a problem. We engage with it to try and resolve it. We have an obligation to try and resolve that conflict. And we want to work on this over here. Instead of saying, don't force us to deal with this, saying we do deal with this, because we are more than one thing at once. And the way Jews hold together, particular and universal, is a challenge, but it's also a challenge that Americans face. And we want to say, what does American politics do for the world or at home, as well as what we imagine we owe each other as citizens. So I think it's a model for us all to try and hold different commitments at once. And that's what we need to do. And I think that's what the people in the past have showed us how it's hard but possible to do.
Friends, be sure to check out Professor James Loeffler's Rooted Cosmopolitans, among other works. Thank you so much for your time and scholarship and inspiration.
It's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.